Before we get started, I'd like to tell a quick dad joke. I tried some of these earlier, and they bombed. So I think it'll be really good. So, what are the strongest days of the week? Saturday and Sunday, because the rest are weekdays. Okay. And now, no matter how well I do on my talk, you'll be like, at least it was better than that joke. I'm glad he stopped telling jokes. That would have been terrible. So this is 7 secret patterns Vue consultants don't want you to know. And this is me. I'm Fritz. I'm this one right here at the first ever VueConf in Poland, right next to Evan, the creator of Vue, for those who don't know him. And as you can see, I'm the only person who's looking at the wrong camera, except for Eduardo, who's looking totally the wrong direction, which is actually cool. You can look either at the camera or... Is anyone else getting some weird sound on this? Da-da-da-da-da. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Is this sounding any better? I think so. Yeah. So I'm the only one looking not at the wrong camera, but not wrong enough for it to be cool, and I think that says a lot about me. And you probably already knew this about me from my jokes. I'm on the Vue team, and I do a lot of work on documentation. And really anything else that contributes to developer experience. I'm a consultant, so I help people build applications, and especially Vue applications. And really anything that affects the developer experience makes my life a lot easier, so it's really kind of selfish. And sometimes I can even get paid by clients to solve their problems by solving something in the tooling or documentation. The secrets I'm going to show you today are in 3 categories. But first I want to give a little note. You're going to see some code, and there's no need to take notes on any of the code examples. I'm going to share these slides at the end. And there's also a repo that I'm going to share that has all of these patterns contained in an application so that you can see them and you can see what they look like in the context of a real application. So no need to take notes. Now the 3 categories are productivity boosts, radical tweaks, and unlocked possibilities. I'm trying to keep with the clickbait theme. And the first productivity boost I have for you today has to do with watchers, making smarter watchers. So how many people, and by the way, how is the audio? Is it better? Is it getting worse again? You know what? I will just try to turn off this one, because this one isn't needed for recording, right? Just for making sure everyone can hear me and I can project my voice. I was in theater once upon a time. Can everyone hear me when I talk like this? Yes. Wonderful. From the diaphragm. So smarter watchers. Has anyone used a pattern like this, where maybe they have some kind of search input, and when the component first loads, they fetch a user list, or some other kind of list of resources, and then whenever the text changes, they fetch a different user list because that search input is used to filter, and maybe do a search on the API. How many people, raise your hand if you've used this pattern before? Okay, quite a few. So fetch uncreated, and then watch to make sure it's always up to date. Now there's actually an option for watchers that makes this a little bit more efficient and helps you deduplicate some of your code. But before we talk about that, I wanted to talk about one little optimization you can make. Watchers can accept method names instead of having to have a function that then just lists the method name. And then to make that run uncreated and every time search text changes, you just add immediate true so that it runs immediately as soon as the component is initialized. Much shorter, helps you deduplicate. I know I've certainly had bugs before from having like, oh yeah, there's some setup that I have to do here, and I didn't turn it into like a separate function because I thought I'd only have to do it one place, and at first it was just like one method call, and then I needed to add a little bit more, and then there's some stuff that I'm doing when search text changes, but not right at the beginning, and this way you can make sure there's no duplication, and even with immediate, handler can still be a function. Now, productivity boost number 2. Component registration. How many people have big lists of imports for components that they're using? And then they list their components here in a single file component. How many people have big lists of imports like that in their components? Yeah, quite a few. Me too. So I'm going to show you how to get around that for some kinds of components. But before I do, I mean, look at how, to support this little template, like this is all the boilerplate that's needed. For base input, base button, base icon, base button. It's so much JS. And probably like inputs and buttons and icons, those are things that you'll be using like all over your application. It's unlikely, you'll do a slight refactor, and then suddenly there'll be no more buttons in your app. So this is a trick I use. Don't be intimidated by all this code, and you don't even have to read it. What I want to show you in particular is require context. Right here. This is a Webpack feature that allows you to require a group of files based on some regex. So following the pattern, they begin with base, and they end with .vue, and they're in the components directory. And this is some code that could go in your source main.js. And they would automatically require and register globally all of these base components, the components that are used all over the place. Now, this is a pattern that you'd only want to do with base components, because for some other components, you actually might have a change in requirements in your application. Like let's say for a sidebar, you might do a refactor, and now there's suddenly no sidebar. But if you're globally registering the sidebar, then it's still included in your final bundle and delivered to your users. So they have to download and run the JavaScript for that component, even though it's never actually used in your app. That's why I only recommend using this pattern for base components, because all of these base components with this pattern will be included in your bundle, whether they're used or not. So like I said, only do that with icons, buttons, other components that are just used everywhere. And I like to use the base prefix for those kinds of components. So now with that pattern, all of this goes away, and we never need it to support this tiny template. Much, much easier, and makes development much faster too. Because just to get started with a very simple component, you don't need to import a bunch of base elements. And creating these components is very convenient. Sometimes you might want to create them just to add a particular class or set of classes to that component so that they're styled in a way that is consistent with the rest of your application. And if you have to import them everywhere, you're tempted to maybe just not create them. Maybe just add those classes everywhere. Duplicate that code unnecessarily. Now, productivity boost number 3. Scoped CSS. In single file components, there's a scoped attribute that makes it so that all of the classes in the style block will automatically be scoped. And the way that it does that is that it adds an attribute that looks like data-v-some random hash that is unique to this component, so that this button will be transformed to button and then an attribute selector for that attribute. And these styles can now no longer affect any other component or any other CSS in your entire application, even if it's outside of Vue, which is very handy. How many people have used this scope styles? Wow, a lot of people. Now, there's one issue. Let's say we introduce this global vendor CSS. I've had this exact problem with Auth0 once upon a time. They've since fixed this problem. But they were using button styles in their CSS, or the button class in their CSS, and I was also using the button class. Now, what happens here when you have a button class selector and then an element selector and then a class selector inside of that? Which one is more specific? It's the global vendor CSS. So what color are my buttons going to be? They're going to be blue. So even though my CSS, because it's scoped, can't mess with their CSS can still mess with mine if I'm using common class names. And then you could say, like, well, why don't you just use, like, BEM or something like that, some kind of pattern to make sure that, all of your class names are really unique. I think, like, well, what's the point of me having the scoped attribute to make my life easier, and then I don't have to think about this stuff? Now I'm, like, double scoping everything so that I don't even need the scoped attribute? That's kind of annoying. So there's an alternative to the scoped attribute that some people don't know about that I wanted to share. And that's module. If you add module instead of scoped, then this style block turns into a CSS module, which means this class is actually added as a property to a style property on the instance, the value of which is a string that looks like this: the name of the component, the name of the class, and then a random hash. So now I don't have to worry about, like, what I call this. This is a button. It's the only button in this component. I can have the same button class across every single component. I don't have to know what the classes being used in other components are. But it will be automatically translated into a unique hash that makes it so that these styles can't influence any other component, and no other component or global CSS can influence my classes. It works really, really well. So this is actually my preferred method of scoping CSS in single file components. And this works out of the box with Vue Loader. You don't need to do any additional setup to get this working. It works just like scoped. You just add module instead. So now these styles can't mess with anything, and we're really happy. And those are my productivity boosts. Next are radical tweaks. These are things that are small changes, but result in a pretty big difference in behavior that you might find desirable in some cases. Radical tweak number 1 is lazy loaded routes. Here's an example of a route that I've defined using Vue Router. Here I'm just requiring the view with default because I'm using Babel. and I can make this route lazy with one small change. And people might be asking, like, why would you need this, and what does lazy mean exactly? So how many people have had an application where you have an admin dashboard, and let's say 5% of your users are admins, but the admin dashboard is like half of your app in code size? How many people have had some kind of situation like that? OK, fair number. In those cases, by making this lazy loaded, only when this route resolves, when a user goes to /admin and has the permissions to actually view the admin dashboard, will this component be fetched. So Webpack actually splits it up into a separate bundle of JavaScript that's only grabbed when the user really needs it. So most users will never see the code in Vue's admin and all of the modules that only Vue's admin uses. Which in some cases can really dramatically improve their build time. I like to do this with all of my routes, actually, just by default. And I found that in some cases, there was one app that I took 10 minutes to move all of their routes from, just like, or all of their routes from, regular routes to using async components. And the Lighthouse score changed from timed out because it was so bad. Like, I didn't even get 0. It just took too long, to 92 with just that one change, which is a pretty massive performance improvement. And also, like, the app feels a lot faster to users because they're only getting the code that they need the first time they go to a route, and also when they go to subsequent routes, they just get any additional code that they might need. A radical tweak number 2, transparent wrappers. So this is probably people's favorite trick that I've shared with them, especially people who maintain big component libraries. So this is an input element, and right now this component is pretty simple. We might have created it to add a class to it, and we haven't added the class yet. But at first, we just want this base input component to work with vModel. And we also want to be able to pass attributes to it, and we want it to work with our event system so that we can listen for focus and stuff like that when we need to. And if we pass a placeholder or something like that to this base input component, Vue's default behavior is to pass any attributes that aren't registered as props onto the root element. So the placeholder will be added to this input without us having to do anything. That works really nicely. And to listen to events, we might have something like focus using .native, the native modifier. And that native modifier on components makes it so that we listen to the native events from the root node instead of events explicitly emitted from the component. And then in this component, we might find that, OK, well, we want to refactor it a little bit. We actually want there to be, we want to wrap this input in a label and then add a label here, and we have a label prop now. But there's an issue. Focus native will no longer work because the root element is no longer our input. It's actually our label. So we can see when our label is focused, but really for this base input component, we want to know when the input is focused, maybe so that we can show some kind of validation or some kind of tip to let them know, oh, hey, here's how you type in a valid phone number, or these are the constraints for your password as they're typing it in. Once they're actually in there and using that input element. So how do we get around this? So some people don't know about this, but Vue offers all the listeners passed to a component on $listeners. And we can actually get any listeners working by merging them into this object and then overriding the behavior of input again, just to make this work with vModel, because vModel will expect an input event, and it expects the value itself rather than an event object like it does on a normal element. And then we use vyon's object syntax to make it listen to all of these listeners. This is another feature that some people don't know about. Vyon actually has an object syntax so that you can pass it a bunch of different events that you want it to listen to, rather than listing events individually. So now our base input focus.native can be updated to just focus, do something. And we can truly use this component, at least in terms of events, exactly like a normal input element. It's beautiful. And I actually recommend doing this refactor right from the beginning, because otherwise what will happen is you'll change the root node. You won't realize, because maybe it was 3 months ago, that you're using the .native modifier somewhere in your application. And then your app will just kind of silently break. Unless you have really good end-to-end tests or unit tests for that component, you won't realize necessarily that something has happened. This component, there's nothing in this component that lets you know, hey, some other component is using .native on me. So anytime you find yourself tempted to use .native, I'd actually say don't. Never use .native. Instead, go right to this pattern and make sure that any events you want are transparently bubble up from the component or from the element that you actually care about. In this case, the input. So that you can just use this base input component like a normal input, but with superpowers. Now, there's still an issue. We talked about this nice behavior of Vue where it passes all attributes that aren't defined as props, like placeholder, onto the root node. And again, the root node is now a label. And what happens when you add a placeholder to a label? I tried it, nothing. You get that attribute technically appears, but it doesn't make any kind of change in what the user sees. So we actually don't want this behavior in this case. We don't want attributes passed transparently to this label. Instead, there's an option that, again, a lot of people don't know about called inherit attrs. If you set that to false, you will turn off Vue's automatic attribute inheritance for components onto the root node. And you can manually bind attrs with a $attrs, attrs standing for attributes, with the $attrs object on the component instance. And again, we're using, just like vyon has an object syntax, vbind has an object syntax that a lot of people don't know about. So we're binding all of these attributes at once, any attributes that are passed to this component, to this input. So now focus, our placeholder actually works. Any attributes will work. Any events that we want to listen to will work. and we have fully transparent wrappers. Now, a lot of people, are there any people who maintain component libraries here? Okay. So, or do you maintain Vue component libraries? At any point, have you found yourself getting users asking, hey, like, we need this other attribute to work, and we need these other like accessibility attributes to work? And I think there are something like 27 different accessibility attributes that are required to work for every component, like if you want your code to be accessible. And then you find yourself adding a huge, huge list of props to get this to work without this pattern, because you're just thinking of every possible attribute that they might need, and then defining it in your props, and then adding all of them to that component. And I've seen some cases where, after learning about this pattern, component library authors have been able to change their, refactor their components down from something like near 1,000 lines, like no joke, to like 30, which is a pretty nice improvement. Any day where I can remove almost 30 lines in one, or almost like 1,000 lines in one file, that's a pretty good day for me. I like those pull requests. So this is a really, really powerful pattern. And here's the full code. And again, this pattern is also demonstrated in a repo that I'm going to show you near the end. But there's one more thing. We've been working hard on Vue 3. And one of the big improvements that we've been trying to make is make this pattern a little bit easier. Because right now, it requires a little bit of boilerplate. Like it still feels a little bit clunky. Like, sure, you can take 1,000 lines down to 30, and that's pretty cool. But this is still a lot of code to get something relatively simple working. We just want this input element to be accessible from the outside so that we can use special props like label when we want to do something special. And then for everything else, it'll just work like a normal input element always. So in Vue 3, this is what we've come up with so far. We've been able to find a way to make this work. This is how you do the transparent wrappers in Vue 3. You just have your props, and then vbind attrs. And listeners will be included inside of attrs in the current design for Vue 3. And in fact, if we didn't have a label, the only thing we'd need is input vbind attrs. That's transparent components. I'm really, really excited about that change. Yay! So those are my radical tweaks. Now on to the unlocked possibilities. Features or patterns that can make something possible that previously you might have thought was impossible. The first unlocked possibility has to do with single root components. So how many people have seen an error like this? You know, you have like 2 divs, and then it's like, oh yeah, Vue complains like you can only have 1 root element actually, so like you need to remove one of those. Maybe you need to wrap everything in another div. I've done this, and I've written a lot of the warnings for this, which is especially painful. It feels like I'm nagging myself. And this is, right now, a kind of annoying restriction with Vue. But fortunately, there is a way around it. There is a way to have patterns like this. This is a navbar component. And as you can see, I have another navbar routes component that I use inside of it. where I list some persistent nav routes, some logged in nav routes, some logged out nav routes, and all of them exist within this UL. Now the problem is, this pattern only works if we can return multiple root nodes from this navbar routes component. Because a UL can only contain LIs. And if it contains something besides an LI, you'll get weird issues, and they may be weird in different ways depending on the browser. So the browser may decide to take the LIs and hoist them out and put them on top of your UL or below your UL, or maybe just show them like somehow next to your UL, but the LI styles don't actually work. There are a lot of different weird things that can happen. And if we use this kind of pattern, if we have like a v4 to get multiple LIs, it kind of looks like we have a single root node. But because of the v4, we're actually getting this multiple times. We'll get that same error that we saw at the beginning, where Vue complains about multiple root nodes. So here's how to fix this. Functional components, using a render function, can actually return an array of nodes instead of just a single one. So in this case, we are iterating over all of our props, and then for each, or we're iterating over all of our routes, and then for each route, we're rendering an LI. And in this case, we're using Vue's JSX syntax inside of a render component, inside of a render function. So it looks very similar to that template we had. But this way will actually work. And we can finally get multi-root components when we need to get this pattern working. And this has made my life a lot easier. It opens up a lot of different patterns. There are not only some cases where just adding like a div around everything is inconvenient and sometimes feels kind of dirty, especially when you don't need it. But in this case, it's actually impossible. Like it would break if we added a div around all of these LIs. Fortunately, very soon, there'll be no more single root node restrictions in render functions, whether they're functional or not, or templates, whether they're functional or not, in Vue 3. So there's just less stuff you have to think about. Try to make things easier. Oh yeah, and the little woohoo, yeah. I just got excited, so I had to add that extra effect. Now, unlock possibility number 2. This is the final one. I think so. So who was here yesterday to see Rahul's talk on the Vue single file component compiler and how that works? He talked about how you can add custom blocks. For example, docs, a docs block that can contain Markdown, or an I18N block that can contain accessibility information. So you can actually define any custom block you want using vter. That is the official extension for Vue in VS Code, actually maintained by a member of both the Vue team and the VS Code team. So in your VS Code options, by defining vector grammar custom blocks and then docs, the name of the block, and then the extension that it should be aliased with, like it should treat it like an MD file and highlight it like an MD file. And then if you run Command-Shift-P, Control-Shift-P, and tell vector to generate the grammar for vector grammar after you've made changes here, and then tell it to reload the window, you'll now get syntax highlighting inside your editor for these custom blocks. And you could create any custom blocks you want. In some cases, you might not even need to mess with anything related to the compiler. For docs, for example, you might just want to be able to write some markdown and have it be syntax highlighted as markdown so that people can read documentation for a component in line in the same file that the component is defined in. And I've met some teams who like to have something like this actually right at the top of their component files, so that when they're jumping in and they just want to get some quick like interface information, like what are the main props that are used, like here's a list of all the required props, and here are some of the optional props, and what different slots does it take, and what are some examples of how I might use this in different contexts. They'll have that right at the beginning so that when you're switching to this file real quick, just to see like, how do I use this component again? You have like the best documentation that you can imagine with great syntax highlighting right there at the tops for you to see it. And if you decided that you wanted to get into the compiler stuff, and I hope with Rahul's talk you're feeling a little bit more comfortable with it than you were before, where if someone asked you yesterday, it's like, do you think, like if your boss asked you, is there any way that we could, like maybe modify the way that single file components are compiled by Vue? You'd be like, no, I can't do that. No, it's maybe possible, but like no, I can't do that. I'm not a compiler developer. But as Rahul showed you, you can just use JavaScript, and oftentimes relatively little JavaScript, and add it to the vue.config.js file, and get some really nice special behavior, and maybe even get all of these docs like pulled out and generated into like a static site that you can share with your team, and you can view online as HTML and see the examples like really beautifully. But you don't have to jump around to figure out, okay, where was the documentation for this component again? It's just in the component file. Now, if you can't get enough of these secret patterns and many more, I actually include these and many, many others in Vue Enterprise Boilerplate. That's a repo that I maintain. And it's really like the only repo that I have where I strongly encourage bike shedding. Like if someone wants to open an issue and say like, I do this way, like why do you do it that way here? Or this doesn't make sense to me. Like please explain this to me. Like I actually want those kinds of issues. Or if you found a pattern that you found helpful, I love seeing those kinds of issues too. Like this is basically what I use for any new projects that I do for almost every single client, unless they want something really weird. And even in those cases, I'll usually pull a lot of stuff from Vue Enterprise Boilerplate. I found it works as a great base for almost every client that I work with. And I've heard good feedback from a lot of people too. How many people have built applications using Vue Enterprise Boilerplate as a base? Just one. So we have a lot more to go. Definitely check it out. It's not only like great for starting a new project, but even if you're not, a lot of people use it as a way to learn about new patterns and a way to learn about things that they could add to their development experience in their existing project that you can pull out. And it is extremely well documented. I care a lot about documentation for this project too. So like everything is explained, everything down to like which kinds of JavaScript features like we're using, and links to like documentation to learn more about those JavaScript features. Because I find in a lot of teams, you have a lot of different kinds of skill sets. Some people are like really, really good at CSS, and some people are really, really good at JavaScript. And it really helps to have links to the parts where you are a little bit weaker, so that you can fill in some of those gaps of knowledge when it might be useful to you, if it's useful to you. And here's the awkward part. You can like support me, I guess, in my open source work and trying to like make people's lives easier and stuff on Patreon at patreon.com/ChrisViewFritz. And that will give me more time to work on lots of stuff that makes the dev experience easier, especially when it's something that isn't enough of a pain for one of my clients that they could pay me to do it. This really, really helps with a lot of those other resources, especially for beginners, because most of my clients tend to be at the enterprise level. I want to say a big thanks to John Leider, who's my Vusionary level sponsor, who maintains, he's the creator and chief maintainer of Vuetify, a really, really nice component library that I definitely recommend you checking out in case you just want to get started like prototyping an app and don't have to worry about making it pretty. And you can find these slides as promised at github.com/chrisvfritz/7secretpatterns. And you can find me on GitHub, Twitter, at chrisvfritz. That'll probably be also on my gravestone. Right. And that is it. Yep. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, I'm just checking the time. Yeah, go ahead.
You said you're a consultant.
Yeah.
How do I find out like your rates or things like that? Or how do you consult?
So shoot me an email. My email is really difficult to remember. It's chrisvfritz@gmail.com. Yeah, so my middle name, believe it or not, is not Vue. My parents did not have that kind of insight. It wasn't like a destiny thing. Or one of those things where like, oh, your name is Dennis, so you became a dentist? No, my middle name is actually Vincent. But my Patreon is ChrisViewFritz for the lulz. Yeah, so chrisvfritz@gmail. You can also reach out to me on Twitter too. Yeah, go ahead.
So in stock blocks and single file components, for a while, we're using SAS in those, and it worked out pretty well.
Yeah.
We quickly ran up against a problem where we have a lot of global variables, and when SAS compiled, it just doesn't know about those variables or what to find. So then we started importing the variables files, and that started getting kind of cumbersome on every component.
Yeah.
That includes all these variables. Is there a good way around that, or is it just a matter of?
Absolutely. Yeah, so first I'll say I actually like including one file. In Vue Enterprise boilerplate, you'll see it's import design, like @design, because that's the alias for the one file that like takes all of my design variables and mix-ins and stuff like that and puts them together. And the reason I actually like to have that in there, even though it's not necessary, and I will tell you how to get rid of it, is because it acts as a little breadcrumb for people to know like where these things are coming from, so that if they decide like design, like what is design again, and they can do a quick file search, and I'll actually bring that up. Do I have Vue Enterprise boilerplate open? Cool. They look for design. Okay, design index.css. And they can see, okay, we have colors, durations, fonts, layers, sizes. Okay, it's really, I want a new size variable. And they go here, and they basically have breadcrumbs to find like where to add new styles, new variables, new mixins, things like that. Otherwise, I found in some projects, especially when there are new people coming on and maybe there's not the best onboarding process. I don't know if anyone here has an ideal onboarding process for their developers and everything always goes great and within a day everybody knows what they're doing. I've never been in a situation like that. I try very hard, but it's never 100% optimal. So what I found happens sometimes is people just treat these as magic variables, and they don't know where they come from. And so when they need to create a new variable, instead of creating one, they might just hard code a color or hard code some pixel value or something, because hey, this is what makes it look good, even if over time it's going to make the site look really inconsistent and create some styling bugs. Yeah, but if that's not an issue, especially if you're on a smaller team where communication like that is a lot easier. The biggest front-end team for a single app that I've worked on is 18 people, which actually worked very well for them. It was a pretty big app, so they were working on different parts of it, but there were a lot of shared assets like this that they had to manage. If you're working on a smaller team, and especially if you're a solo dev, you can get rid of this with the data option on for Sass Loader. The data option allows you to provide a string of any arbitrary Sass that you want to essentially prepend to all of your entry files, and each component is its own entry file. And if you're in a Vue project using Vue CLI 3, which Vue Enterprise Boilerplate is built off of, you could do that with the Webpack chain syntax, and going in and finding the Sass loader and changing just that one little option. It gives you really nice fine-grained control, so you can change one part of one option without just overriding everything. Yeah, great question. Other questions? I think I saw a hand in the back. I didn't want to forget them. Okay. Maybe they changed their mind, or maybe that was the same question. Go ahead.
You said in your Vue Enterprise Boilerplate that you give full descriptions of everything. I'm in testing, and so we're always looking at how things affect the DOM, because the CSS selector is what we use to identify unique elements on the page and make sure that they really are unique. Yeah. And especially if we're doing internationalization, that's especially important, because you don't want to use a with text. If you're doing German or Chinese, that's not going to work in your CSS selector. So I was just asking, in your descriptions, do you describe how those affect the DOM, because that can affect testing?
In my descriptors for what?
In your Vue Enterprise Boilerplate GitHub, do you describe how things ultimately come down to the DOM?
So do I describe how to do internationalization, or? Oh, these optimizations? Well, they'll affect the DOM by, first, do you have a specific one that you're thinking of, a specific one of those tips?
The one where you said that it changed the property, it was button_button.
Like the transparent wrappers one, or? Okay, yeah, so for the transparent wrapper components, that actually works really, really well for things like accessibility and things like internationalization, because you can just pass anything you want onto those, any attributes that work with the element that you're targeting, just go passed on down to it. So whether it's an ARIA label, or something like a placeholder, or something like a name.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, great question.
I'm starting to do docs. So I was using JS block for cell sets.
Yeah.
And that seemed pretty cool with the whole docs comes from SFC block.
Yeah.
So there's some data that I want down there, but there's data up there, but some of it overlaps.
Yeah.
I didn't want to have redundant data. So do you have any advice on how I should do that?
So if you're using a JS block, you said, you could technically And Rahul, just jump in here if I'm saying anything that doesn't make sense from your perspective. He's a compiler master. You should technically be able to hook into Vue's compiler and reach in and parse the JavaScript comments and pull those out and convert them into documentation. So somewhere else. So you could have some kind of script that goes and reads all of your .vue files with the custom compiler and pulls out those comments and turns them into nice docs. Yeah. Should be possible, right? There's a what? There's a package for that? There's a package for it already. Nice. Do you happen to remember what it is? Vue.Gen API? OK. Check that out. And if it's wrong, find Rahul and make him tell you the real one.
Does Rahul have a Twitter or anything?
Yeah, you are ZNCK? Oh, zero CK? Oh, ZNK. OK, ZNCK0. OK. Any other questions? Fragen? Preguntas? Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Chris. Two things. You mentioned the lazy load of the component, and you say import at vue/admin. So those components, the Vue file, they are already compiled, and you had to place them in the Vue directory or in the public. Where do they find
The base components?
Yeah, when you say import at vue./admin to do the lazy load,
Yeah.
where exactly are the files?
So when I used @views, that's an alias that I set up with Webpack. I mean, that could also be, the import takes anything that you'd use with require or with import something from something. So those same strings that will work there will work inside of that import.
So it's part of Webpack and set up again.
Yeah. The is an alias that I set up, and if you look in Vue Enterprise boilerplate, I have an aliases.config.js where I have all of the configuration for those aliases. Yeah, great question.
The CSS module, it had the dollar style. Once again, I was having problem. I was asking Rahul yesterday about dynamic components.
Yeah.
And my scope does not work with that. So module is supposed to work with that. Somehow how it defines that data special attribute is defined. It would add that to a dynamic component.
I think I missed part of that. Here, I'm gonna come down a little bit so I can hear you better. Yeah, v4.
And these components are dynamically created.
Yeah.
So would that special data attribute be added to those as well?
In the case of a root node, like when you have multiple root nodes.
One root node,
Yeah.
but with a v4 of all the components. And I want to style all these dynamic components.
And you added a data on a component that was using v4.
I guess so. If I'm styling.
Yeah, as long as that component is using the transparent wrapper pattern, then data and anything else, any attribute you can think of, will be passed on. As long as you're using the transparent wrapper pattern to all of those components in the v4.
Talking about the CSS part, not the transparent wrapper, where you define a class.
Yeah.
And you're saying somehow Vue
Yeah.
would hash it and put a special
Yeah.
string, right? But then it will only do for.
So if you pass that to a child component, is that what you mean? Like if you add it to a child component rather than an element?
Like the child is not even fixed. Like sometimes when you define it, normally you have one. If I have a dynamic, like a v4.
Yeah. I'll come back around and I'll take a look at an example. We'll figure it out. Any other questions before we wrap up and let the other speaker set up? Yeah, go ahead.
With the style, the module, and the scope.
Yeah.
When I went to develop the tool, they don't generate source maps. How do I get source maps from the single when I'm looking like stats or CSS?
In vue.config.js, source map true. This is from Vue Enterprise boilerplate. Oh, thank you. Yeah, we've had, like, it's not just me. Like, we've had hundreds of contributors make it better. So, yeah, I'm really, really grateful. I only call myself curator for a reason. You know, I've written a lot of it, but, you know, we've definitely gotten so much help, and also so much help from people like looking over things for me, you know, like really like versions that aren't ready yet and are really bad, and they help me make them so that they're actually good enough to show people. So yeah, it's a huge team and community effort. Yeah, go ahead. Vue Enterprise boilerplate? Will the secrets ever make it into the documentation? You could submit a cookbook recipe. These slides are MIT licensed, so actually, like, you could give the same talk if you want, and you can get paid for it if you want. I don't mind. It'll be a little bit weird if you don't change the slide where you're introducing yourself, but but yeah, you could submit cookbook recipes for like any of these if they don't already exist. For some of them, Sarah Drasner is the person who leads the cookbook, and I actually am pretty hands-off with the cookbook because she honestly does a better job than I ever could. So yeah, and she's always happy to take new submissions. Pardon? Change the Twitter handle? Yeah, change the Twitter handle too. Yeah, maybe do a run-through and just make sure. Yeah. Cool. Well then, thank you very much for all of your attention.